6 o'clock hours, March 27th, 1945. North Field, Guam. The runway was still streaked with oil from the night's returns. Squadron Engineering Officer Daryl W. Landau stood under the sagging right wing of a B-29 and watched his crew pull what was left of cylinder number 14 out of a smoking R-3350. The thing didn't look like a precision engine part anymore. It looked like a piece of burnt meat, cracked, blackened head, rings welded into the gouged cylinder wall. Number 14 again, the crew chief said, half to himself. Landau just nodded at 31 years old. 6 months with the 19th Bombardment Group. 18 burned-out cylinders were placed in the past week alone on the chalkboard in the group's ready room. Someone had drawn up casualty lists in 2 neat columns. Lost to enemy action *14 B-29s over Tokyo in the last month. Lost to engine fires *23. The numbers were obscene. Tokyo's fighters and flak had destroyed 14 Superfortresses in 4 weeks. Their own engines had destroyed twice that many. Landau had watched 5 perfectly flyable B-29s blow up or crash in the landing pattern coming back from raids. Engines on fire, wings folding. Men who'd survived 8 hours over Japan, dying 3 minutes from the end of the mission. Officially, the Japanese were the enemy. Practically, right now, the far more reliable killer of B-29s at Northfield was the Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone bolted under each wing. And from where Landau was standing, staring at another burnt cylinder from the same position and the same engine on the same side, it was starting to look less like bad luck and more like bad design. If they didn't fix it, Tokyo wouldn't have to shoot down any more B-29s. The airplanes would obligingly kill themselves. All he had to work with was a few tire mechanics, a sheet metal shop, a maintenance log full of ugly patterns, and a $2 idea. The B-29 Superfortress was supposed to be the pinnacle of American heavy bomber design. Pressurized, remote-controlled guns, range and payload that made B-17s and B-24s look like antiques. On paper, it could haul 10 tons of bombs from the Marianas to Tokyo and back at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach. All of that depended on one brutally powerful, brutally temperamental piece of machinery. The Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone .18 cylinders. Twin rows. Air-cooled. Nominally 2,200 horsepower each. More with war emergency power. 4 of them hung under a B-29s wings turned the airplane into a 140,000-pound battering ram. When they worked, they were magnificent. When they didn't, they became blowtorches. The early R-3350s had a catalog of sins. Overheating on takeoff, a fuel leaks, carburation issues, cowl flap quirks, and, most insidious, localized hot spots in certain cylinders that led to detonation, cracked heads, and fires. The Pacific temperature and loading profile for the Marianas raids made everything worse. Out of Guam, Saipan, Tinian, bombers took off from rough coral strips in tropical heat, grossed out near maximum weight. Pilots held high power longer just to unstick the wheels and claw for altitude before they ran out of runway and patience. Cowl flaps, the movable doors that controlled cooling airflow around the cylinders, had to be finagled between open enough to keep the engines from cooking themselves and closed enough to not add drag that shaved off speed and range. Engineers in stateside labs knew the numbers for climb and cruise. Out here, reality was a B-29 captain staring at cylinder head temperature gauges on all 4 engines, praying the needles would decline a little before something went bang. On Northfield's hardstands, ground crews like Landau's saw the consequence. The squadron maintenance logs were not bedtime reading. They were the diary of a marriage between genius and frustration. Landau spent nights hunched over them in a canvas-walled shack lit by a single bulb, flipping through pages that all began to sound the same. Ship 4293927. Number 2 engine, rear row, cylinder number 14 burn valve, replaced. Ship 4265311. Number 3 engine, rear row, cylinder number 12 cracked head, probable overheating. Ship 4293708. Number 2 engine fire on climb out, feathered, emergency return, 1 crewman injured. He started circling entries. Same engine positions, same cylinder numbers, same complaints about cylinder head temps on climb, and even at cruise, Despite what should have been safe settings, he walked out onto the hardstand with a clipboard and a mechanic in tow and had them pull cowlings off several cooled-down engines. Without the streamlined panels on, the R-3350 looked like a monstrous steel flower. 2 rings of cylinders, exhaust manifolds, intercoolers, baffles. Baffles were those unglamorous pieces of sheet metal installed around and between cylinders, meant to direct cooling air exactly where it was needed. Air-cooled engines don't cool by more air alone. They cool by properly directed air, that if a cylinder sits in a shadow of poor airflow, it runs hotter. A little hotter may not show up immediately. A lot hotter, over time, becomes a problem. Landau crouched in his cell, ran a hand along the rear row of fins. You didn't have to be a Wright engineer to see it. The way the factory baffles were designed, the front row of cylinders got a strong, clean flow. The rear row, particularly the ones in the lower quadrants, sat in the wake, shielded by their neighbors. Certain fins were visibly more caked with baked-on oil residue, hinting that they'd been running hotter for longer. He had a mechanic set up a smoke wand in F. Run of an engine and ran it briefly at idle with the baffle segments exposed. Smoke traced paths around the cylinders. Where it flowed strongly, fins were washed clean. Where it eddied, it curled lazily and clung, showing dead zones. Around cylinder 14, he saw a dead zone. "See that?" he said to his crew chief. "This guy's hiding in a pocket. He's not getting the same wash as his buddy up front." "Sir, we can't change Guam's air," the man joked weakly. "No," Landau said, mind already turning. "But we can tell it where to go." Back in the shack, he sketched simple shapes at first. A bit of bench sheet, a scoop here, a deflector tab there if he didn't want to redesign the engine. He just wanted a cheap, easily fabricated way to nudge a little more cooling air onto the Kerr cylinders. He realized the solution didn't have to be elegant, just had to be bolted on and not fall off. The part, when it finally left the squadron sheet metal shop, looked like nothing much but a curved piece of aluminum with a flange, drilled for a few rivets. Maybe 8 inches long, shaped almost like a small gutter. Cost of materials, about $2 if you counted scrap and fasteners. Cost and time, a few hours of cutting and bending to T.O. Landau. It was an experiment T.O. the men who'd been losing friends to engine fires. It was a ray of stubborn hope. He called it a baffle extension bolted in place near the leading edge of the troublesome rear cylinders. It would act as a scoop, stealing a bit of the high-energy airflow coming past the front row and directing it straight into the narrow gap around number 14's fins. The theory was simple: increase airflow over that cylinder, drop its head temperature margin by even 25 to 30 degrees, reduce detonation, valve burning, and cracking risk dramatically. He pitched it to the group engineering officer. "We're within our authority to make local mods that don't interfere with structural integrity or fuel systems," he argued. "This is sheet metal and rivets. If it doesn't work, we pull it. If it does, we keep some of our birds from burning up from inside." The older man was skeptical. "You're telling me a $2 chunk of scrap is going to fix what Wright hasn't?" he snorted. "I'm telling you we're losing more ships to fires than flak," Landau said evenly. "And if that piece of metal buys us one less funeral, it's worth every cent." In the end, like most decisions in the field, it came down to, does this hurt anything else? It didn't. They picked one B-29, one engine, one cylinder. The sheet metal men drilled and riveted the baffle extension into place on #2engine. Cylinder 14, the next morning, the crew flew a local test hop, circling Guam for a couple of hours under close observation. Landau sat in the radio compartment with a headset on and a clipboard, listening to the flight engineer read off cylinder head temperatures at intervals on the unmodified engines. The problem cylinders peaked dangerously close to redline during long climbs and then hovered high at cruise. On the modified engine, number 14's needle still climbed, but stopped short of where it usually hovered. The delta was small but distinct. Number 14, number 2 engine, running about 30 degrees cooler than usual in this profile, the engineer reported. Landau circled the figures, felt something unclench in his chest. "Ask him if he feels any asymmetry," he said. "Any change in drag?" The pilot replied that the airplane felt the same as always. "No weird, yeah." No pulled out on landing. They pulled the cowling and inspected. The new baffle extension was still in place. No cracks, no obvious chafing. Cylinder fins looked a shade less baked. IT wasn't proof, not yet. But it was enough that he ordered his section to start fabbing more. Rolling out a field mod in a wartime B-29 group wasn't as simple as slapping it on everything overnight. For one, you couldn't take too many planes out of commission at once. The group had missions to fly. Tokyo wasn't waiting for them to sort their cooling issues. For another, higher-level engineers and Wright representatives on the island were wary. They weren't angry. They just didn't want a bunch of local tinkering to create new, different failures on a bombardment group already under the microscope. The B-29 program was the jewel and problem child of the USAF. Test on a limited number of ships came to ruling. Document cylinder head temps and any anomalies carefully. So they did. Over the next 2 weeks, Landau shop installed the cheap, curved baffle extension on selected aircraft, 2 in his squadron, a few more in another. Always on the same suspect cylinders. Pilots and flight engineers were quietly briefed. ShipX has a local cooling mod on number 2 cylinder 14. Watch and log CHTs. Report any anomalies. The missions continued. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Guam. All sent their streams of silver shapes north. Chin's group hit Tokyo. Other groups hit Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. The Japanese fighters shot some down. Flak got some. But in Landau's logbooks, another line started changing to heat-related aborts. Once a regular feature like the weather began to dip for the modified ships that on heavily loaded takeoffs, CHTs stayed ugly on stock engines, occasionally forcing aborts or early featherings. On modified engines, the worst offenders now behaved like the rest. Engine fires still happened. No magic charm could erase every fuel leak or mechanical fault. But they stopped clustering around number 14 on number 2 and number 3 in quite the same way he watched his mechanics' hands. They spent more time replacing normal field wear parts and less pulling burnt chunk. S of the same cursed cylinders. The group engineering officer, initially dismissive, started dropping by Landau's shack more often. You still got numbers on those? He asked one evening. Landau slid the latest charts over. Fewer CHT overheat spikes on the modded engines, he said simply. If it's placebo, it's the most persistent one I've ever seen. The $2 pieces of metal kept going on. Within a month, enough reporting had trickled up that people beyond Guam were paying attention. Wright field reps, once prickly guardians of factory settings, quietly requested measurements and sketches. Other groups in the Marianas began asking, through informal channels, what's this little scoop thing we're hearing about? Nobody called it a miracle. Nobody pretended it solved the B-29s every engine woe. But in a war where mere inches on a CHT gauge could separate routine mission from engine on fire over water, those scoops were a lifeline. And every B-29 that came home on 4 healthy engines instead of 3, or none, was a statistical thumb in the eye of the Japanese. Numbers in the Pacific Air War can be numbing. Tonnage dropped. Sorties flown. Fighters destroyed. Cities burned. But here's a pair worth sitting with in the preceding month. 14 B-29s from Landau's broader wing have been destroyed by Japanese fighters and flak over Japan. In the same span, 23 have been lost or written off due to engine fires and related failures. Not damaged. Lost, some ditched. Some broke up in flight. Some burned beyond repair after limping home. The secret enemy killing the Superfortress force wasn't the rising sun flag on a Zero's tail fin. That IT was a couple hundred extra degrees on a cylinder head in the wrong part of a climb. As the baffle mod spread through his group, Landau began to see the shape of its impact. Ships that previously carried the black mark of prone to hot number 2 engine. On engineers' kneeboards now came and went without special notes. Crew chiefs who developed superstitious. Rituals around certain nacelles started to relax. On one mission, an aircraft assigned a full set of the baffle mods lost an engine, but to flak, not fire. The crew feathered it and kept going. That one, Landau thought, was going to drop one way or another. But at least it wasn't because we cooked it ourselves. He did the math in the narrow, unglamorous way engineering officers do. If you can reduce engine-related total losses by even 5 or 10% in a given period with a field mod, how many bombers and, more importantly, how many crews is that? In the Marianas, individual engineering officers weren't the only ones thinking that way. WWII late spring 1945. B-29 loss rates to mechanical fires had declined across the theater, partly due to factory fixes, partly due to crew experience, and partly due to cheap, stupid-looking pieces of metal bent by men like Landau and bolted where airflow needed help, but that's the tea. Hing about secret guns and impossible feats in war. Sometimes the most important weapon is not what you point at the enemy, but what you bolt onto your own kit to keep it alive long enough to do its job. When people tell stories about the B-29, they talk about big things, Tibbets, and the Enola Gay, Curtis LeMay, and city-burning fire raids. Pilots who wrestled shot-up Superfortresses back to base. Gunners like Chun who turned ramming runs into fighter graveyards. They don't usually talk about a tired engineering officer on Guam staring at logs at 2 a.m., or a nameless sheet metal tech cursing as he tries to drill a baffle plate in a cramped nacelle. There are no medals of honor for kept engines from running too hot. There are, however, thousands of men who live to see peacetime because someone cared enough to think past. That's just how it is. The $2 chunk of aluminium Landau's crew bent and riveted onto those R-3350s wasn't a magic bullet. But in a month where engine fires had destroyed more B-29s than Japanese fighters, had it nudged the odds in a war of attrition and statistics. Nudging the odds is everything. If you'd walked through Northfield in mid-45 and asked the flight crews who saved them, they'd have pointed at the kid in the CFC blister who hosed down fighters, the pilot who made the right call when an engine coughed, maybe the chaplain who said the right words before they taxied. They wouldn't have pointed at Daryl Landau. But every time a B-29 rolled back into its hard stand with 4 engines still turning where last month one had exploded on that profile, the ghost of an idea in his maintenance shack had quietly chalked up another win. How one mechanic used a $2 piece of metal and saved more B-29s than Japan shot down. Sounds like an exaggeration. That it isn't. Not really, because when you add up every aircraft the enemy never got a chance to finish off because it didn't catch fire first, every crew that never had a ditch because their cylinder temp stayed just inside the line, that silly little baffle did exact. What the best battlefield innovations always do. Turn a chronic accepted risk into something manageable. That's not the stuff of recruiting posters, but it's the stuff that gets you enough airplanes to fill the sky over Tokyo in the first place, and enough men making it back to sit in folding chairs in VFW halls decades later, telling stories about that one time over Japan, never quite grasping how close they came to having no stories to tell at all. Up there, Superfortresses blasted. Fighters out of the sky. Down here, at 6 o'clock on a March morning on Guam, a man with a clipboard watched another burnt cylinder come out of an engine and decided he was tired of reading the same entry in the log. He drew a curve on scrap paper, had someone cut and bend it, riveted it on. And in the long run, that little act of irritation and craft killed more unseen enemies than any single perfect mission ever did.